Hello and welcome back. We're going into our fourth video on Chapter 1, Biodiversity. Once again, I'm Miss Delia, and if you're ready, let's continue. So in this video, we're going to go into 1.5 Domain Eukarya Kingdom Fungi. And as usual, before we go into the content, let's have a look at the learning outcomes for this subtopic. I hope that by the end of this lesson, you will be able to state the unique characteristics of fungi, state the classification of fungi into three major phyla, and also state their importance. Now, if you're ready, let's continue. Okay, so first things first, we're talking about things like mushrooms. So that is what is in fungi. And we're going to talk about its unique characteristics. And first things first, fungi are eukaryotes. They are mostly multicellular, and their mode of nutrition is heterotrophic. Now, specifically, they are heterotrophic saprophytic. That means they release their digestive enzymes on decaying material and then absorb the resultant nutrient molecules through their cells. Okay, so penghadaman ini berlaku di luar daripada badan fungi. Lepas tu bahan tu sudah dicerna di luar menggunakan enzim-enzim dia, baru dia serap ke dalam sel, ke dalam tisu dia. Okay, so with that being said, most of them are kind of not parasitic. Macam kita tengok kulat-kulat, dia akan makan benda yang sudah reput, sudah mati. Okay, a lot of them they consume decaying matter, but some of them are parasitic in that they go and consume living matter. Several of them have mutualistic relationships with other organisms as well. They are typically not motile, although a few of them have a phase where they can move around. Some of them have a motile phase. All right, another thing about fungi is that they are non-vascular organisms. So they don't have any vascular system. Dia tiada xylem phloem, dia tiada saluran darah macam kita. And like plants, fungi have an alternation of generations. Some part of the fungi's life, it will live as a diploid, and some part of the fungi's life, it will live as haploid. So dia akan bergilir, kadang dia haploid, kadang dia diploid. Itu maksud alternation of generations. Alternation of generations in fungi is a lot more confusing than alternation of generation in plants. So you don't need to read into too much detail about this one. Fungi will reproduce by means of spores, and these spores are usually wind disseminated. So spora dia disebarkan melalui angin, that's what the second part means. And they reproduce by both sexual, which is meiotic division, and asexual, mitotic spores. Both sexual and asexual spores may be produced, but it depends on the species and also the living conditions. Okay, so another thing about fungi you need to know is that they have a filamentous body plan. The filaments are called hyphae. What is filamentous? Filamentous means the structure is like filaments of string. Dia bukan satu-satu biji sel yang melekat sama-sama macam kita, tapi dia lebih kepada rantai-rantai ataupun tali-tali sel. Okay, so as you can see from the diagram down here, it looks like the fungus is made out of lots and lots of small strings. So that is a filamentous body plan. Filaments are called hyphae. The hyphae are long, branched, and thread-like. So dia panjang, dia bercabang, dan dia seperti thread, seperti benang. These hyphae, when there are a lot of them, they can form a mass or tissue-like aggregation called mycelium. So, bila ada banyak hyphae berkumpul bersama-sama, kita biasanya tidak panggil dia tisu, kita biasanya panggil dia mycelium. Okay, so this is a diagram showing how the mycelium can be above ground and also underground. Ini kita tidak panggil akar, kita masih panggil dia sebagai hyphae and mycelium. Okay, so the mycelium underground looks like the brown picture underneath, and the one above ground that we usually eat is the reproductive structure and the spore-producing structures. Kalau dia sudah naik di atas tanah, itu biasanya around the time yang dia mau menghasilkan spora untuk pembiakan. Okay. So this is what the spore looks like in comparison to the hypha and the mycelium. So bila ada spore, okay, dia sampai di tempat yang sesuai, spore itu akan bercambah, dia akan mula untuk tumbuh hypha, macam di sebelah kiri itu, dan hypha itu makin lama makin memanjang, makin membesar sampailah dia membentuk mycelium. Okay, so we have a few more unique characteristics of fungi to look at. Although fungi are usually considered by people who don't like vegetables, they would see fungi as plants, but actually they're not. They lack chloroplast and they are therefore not dependent on light, and they can occupy dark habitats and grow in any direction. The cell walls of fungi are made up of chitin ataupun chitin, macam mana pun kamu mau baca supaya kamu ingat dia punya ejaan. But I'm gonna say the cell wall is made up of chitin. And the energy reserve in fungi is glycogen, not starch. So it's similar to humans in that sense. They store it in glycogen. Okay, and when we talk about the hyphae, there are two main types of hyphae that we usually talk about. The two types of hyphae, if it's one single strand, we call it hypha, but when it's many, we call it hyphae. There are septate hyphae, which are hyphae that are divided by cross walls, called septa. Kalau satu sahaja, septum. Into individual cells containing one or more nucleus. So kalau kamu tengok macam di bawah tu, dia ada benda yang pisahkan hyphae itu kepada beberapa sel. So benda yang memisahkan itu digelar sebagai septum. And the other one is non-septate or sinusitic. Non-septate hyphae are not divided into cells. So they are multi-nucleated. Dia memang, the whole thing is one big cell, and that one big cell has many nucleus. Okay, as you can see in the diagram down here, it's clear to see that the one on the left is a septate hypha with the separation, and the one on the right is the sinusitic hypha with no septate. And this is an illustration of those. So this is types of hypha under the microscope, and also a diagram on the right to show how they look like. On the left, you see that is a fruit that has grown mold. So the white stuff is the hypha that has formed a mycelium. The diagram in the middle here is the mycelium under a microscope. And when we are talking about septate and non-septate hypha, we're talking about this diagram on the right. Kalau dia adalah septate hypha, which means dia dipisahkan oleh septa, kadang-kadang satu nukleus sahaja di satu sel. Kadang-kadang dia adalah multinucleated. So kamu tengok di sini, dia ada septum yang pisahkan, tapi dalam setiap sel itu dia ada lebih daripada satu nukleus. So that is also possible depending on the species. And down here we have the sinusitic hypha where there is no separation at all. Okay, so those are the types of hyphae that are in the syllabus. Here is some extra information for you. This is not in your syllabus, but I just want to share it with you anyway. On the left here, we have the hyphae of some fungi that are parasites. When they are parasites, they are absorbing nutrients from cells or tissues of living host. And these parasitic fungi usually have some hyphae that are modified as Haustoria. Haustoria is a special hyphae, nutrient-absorbing hyphal tips that penetrate the tissues of the host. So, dia benda yang sama saja dengan keseluruhan fungus itu, cuma dia lebih kecil dan dia boleh masuk ke dalam sel host. Okay, so it goes into the host cell and steals the nutrients. That is for parasitic fungi. They are also predatorial fungi. Some fungi will eat small organisms like small animals. So, those will have hyphae that are adapted for preying on animals. Dia macam boleh tangkap lah, as shown in this electron microscope picture of this. Okay, all right, so that is it for the unique characteristics of fungi. And as you already know, fungi is a very, very diverse kingdom. There's so many different shapes and colors, and uses of them as well, and they live in different habitats. So thinking about this diversity of fungi, we start to classify them into several phylum. The main way of classifying fungi is based on its spore-bearing structures. Biasanya kita pisahkan, tengok dia punya spore-bearing structure, bahagian yang mengandungi spore itu menghasilkan spore, apa bentuk dia, apa ciri-ciri dia. Lepas tu kita pisahkan kepada beberapa phylum. So we're only going to focus on 3 phyla, which is Phylum Zygomycota, Phylum Ascomycota, and Phylum Basidiomycota. In some books or some sources on the internet, you may find that there is more than these 3 phyla, and that is also correct. Okay, memang sumber-sumber lain mungkin diorang akan menerokai fungi yang di luar phylum ini atau dia tambah phylum lain. Tidak salah, cuma dalam silibus kamu kita fokus kepada 3 phylum ini. Right? So in your syllabus, we're only focusing on these 3 phyla. Alright, so let's have a look at each one of them. We're going to start with Phylum Zygomycota. This is an example of a species of Zygomycota under the microscope, since they're very small. Alright, you may be very familiar with Zygomycota already. An example of Zygomycota is Rhizopus species. They are most commonly seen as black bread mold. So kalau makanan kita start berkulat, terutamanya kulat yang hitam pada roti itu biasanya adalah Rhizopus species. They are very important as decomposers. Some Zygomycota are also insect parasites. Some Zygomycota are also commensal symbionts. Commensal symbionts means dia ada simbiosis dengan organisme lain, tapi dia tidak memudaratkan organisme tersebut. So, dia bukan macam parasite. Zygomycota can do asexual reproduction. When it is asexual reproduction, they are producing haploid spores that are produced in sporangia. They can also do sexual reproduction. If it is sexual reproduction, they are producing zygospores, macam zygote, zygospores, that develop in zygosporangia. Okay, so we have a diagram here showing the sexual reproduction in Rhizopus. Kalau dia mau hasilkan, kalau dia mau buat sexual reproduction, mesti ada hypha daripada mycelium daripada 2 fungus yang berbeza, 2 individu yang berbeza. Satu itu akan dianggap sebagai plus, satu itu akan dianggap sebagai minus. Diorang tiada jantan betina, so kita boleh anggap dia sebagai plus minus. Ataupun dalam diagram ini kita boleh nampak dia sebagai merah dan hitam. So 2 mycelium yang berdekatan ini, diorang akan hasilkan sel, okay? Dari ini dia memang akan pisahkan dia dengan septum lah, dia akan pisahkan dengan mycelium yang lain. They will prepare several nuclei. These cells with the many nuclei will fuse, and then this fusion will form the zygosporangia. And it will look like this when you are studying the structure of the Zygomycota. In here, it is 2N. After some time, it will do meiosis inside. It will produce this fruiting body called sporangium, and that sporangium will release haploid spores. So kita nampak di sini alternation of generations dia. Semasa dia hidup secara normal sebelum sexual reproduction, dia adalah haploid. Bila dia bentuk zygosporangium sahaja, dia diploid. Lepas itu, bila masa untuk hasilkan sporangium daripada zygosporangium, itu adalah balik kepada haploid life cycle. Kalau kamu stress pasal ni, don't need to worry. It's not really something we focus on in your syllabus, and we're just going to move on with the next part of the lesson. Okay, so this, when it looks like this, you just need to remember, if you see this, this is zygosporangium. If you see this structure, it is called sporangium. Itu sahaja untuk Zygomycota. Now we're going to move on to the next phylum. The next phylum is Phylum Ascomycota. The main characters that we usually see in this phylum is penicillium and also truffles. Truffles is kind of like a mushroom, but also not the same phylum as the mushroom that we always eat. But it looks like this. You can Google more about truffles later if you want. All right, so we're just going to talk a little bit more about the characteristics of Phylum Ascomycota. A common example in Phylum Ascomycota is Penicillium species. And common types of Ascomycota that we will see are yeast, powdery mildews, mold, morels, and truffles. And they are also commonly called as sac fungi. Sac, S-A-C, bumaksud, kantong. They are important decomposers in our environments, and they can also form important symbiotic relationships with other organisms. Example, they can be lichens and mycorrhizae. They can do asexual reproduction. When it comes to asexual reproduction of Ascomycota, the conidia, which is this bit at the end here, it's labeled in the diagram, the conidia will pinch off from the conidiophores, sorry. Whereas for their sexual reproduction, the Ascomycota will produce ascospores that will develop in the asci or asci. Okay, so we can see from this diagram here, this is also extra reading. You don't really have to memorize this stuff, but you can use it to try to understand where it starts. Okay, so asexual reproduction is very simple. It's up here, the smaller circle. It just has the conidiophore that contains conidia. And then when it is ready, the conidia akan poop, dicabut, and then dia pergi tempat lain, and dia akan bercambah jadi mycelium dia sendiri. But for its sexual reproduction, it will produce these cup things, okay, these ascus atau ascocarp untuk bentukan dia punya ascospores. So you don't really need to memorize it. You just need to know that it can do asexual reproduction with conidia and sexual reproduction with ascospores. Okay, ito saja. And then we can move on to the next phylum. This phylum is the one you are most familiar with, and it is what we usually think about when we talk about mushroom. This is Phylum Basidiomycota. Let's talk about the characteristics of Basidiomycota. A common example of this phylum is Agaricus species. And common types that we see are mushrooms, bracket fungi, puffballs, rusts, and smuts. They are also commonly called as club fungus. Sebab kebanyakan yang kita nampak dia bentuk macam club. Not the place, but this thing that is usually shown in cartoons, a club. They are also important decomposers in our environments. And this is one of their most important stuff, is they can form mycorrhizae with tree roots, and some of them can be plant parasites. Asexual reproduction is uncommon in Basidiomycota. Some of them do asexual, but most of them do sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction in Basidiomycota is using basidiospores, which develop on the club-shaped basidia. Okay, so this is a diagram that is showing you the simple anatomy of basidia. Basidiomycota, so kita ada dia macam bahagian yang macam tangkai. Lepas tu ada dia punya topi ini. Topi dia dipanggil sebagai pileus. Di bawah pileus ada gills. Okay, inside the gills are lots and lots of basidia. Each of those basidia will produce basidiospores. All right, you can of course compare between these different phyla in fungi, but you don't really have to memorize this stuff. This is only here for your reference. Ini untuk rujukan kamu saja, tidak perlu hafal. Okay, moving on. So we talked about the 3 different phyla of fungi. Now we're going to talk about why they are important to us. The first importance of fungi is as decomposers in our environment. So dia adalah agent yang menguraikan benda dalam alam sekitar. They are decomposers that can absorb nutrients from organic waste and dead organisms. And when fungi degrade waste and dead organisms, water, carbon, and mineral components of organic compounds are released, and these elements are recycled and can be used by other organisms. Their second importance is as symbionts. Okay, so they akan berinteraksi dengan organisme lain dalam symbiosis. Some fungi will form mutualistic relationships with other organisms. So, for example, they can form mycorrhiza. Apa ni mycorrhiza yang saya cakap daripada tadi? Mycorrhiza is the symbiosis between fungi and plant roots. So, the fungus will live next to or live with the plant's roots. They provide minerals from the soil to the plant, and then the plant will provide the fungi with other organic nutrients. So, they akan membentuk satu, it is a symbiosis, and then they're basically helping each other. There are even some plants that cannot survive without the right mycorrhizal fungi to help it grow. Okay, so setengah tumbuhan memang dia tidak dapat bercambah langsung kalau tiada itu mycorrhiza yang sesuai untuk tolong dia. Okay, so this is what you can see. Without the mycelium, without the fungi in the first diagram, the plant is living a bit more poorly. Dia tidak dapat akses banyak nutrien yang ada dalam tanah. Tapi bila ada mycorrhiza fungi untuk tolong dia, sistem peakaran dia macam ada extension. Okay, it's like it has an extension to its root system, makes it even more effective, and the plants also get the benefit from it. And of course, the fungi is going to get the added benefit from the plants. You can even see it sometimes if the mycelium is thick enough, and you can see the result in the crops as well. So kalau kita menanam, bercocok tanam, lebih bagus kalau ada mycorrhiza fungi yang sesuai. Another symbiosis that we can see between fungi and other organisms is in lichen. Lichen is association between a fungus and green algae. Specialized fungal hyphae will penetrate photosynthetic cells and transfer nutrients directly to the fungus. And this lichen can live in areas of extreme conditions and contribute to soil formation. Kalau kamu pernah nampak benda ini di alam sekitar, mungkin sebelum ni kamu tidak tahu, sekarang kamu tahu itu adalah lichen. If you're walking around, maybe have a look. Is what you're seeing just normal kulat or is it a lichen? Another importance is as pathogens. Fungi can also be pathogenic in that they are parasites. They can live in other organisms and become harmful to the host. They can become pathogens, cause many important diseases such as the ringworm, athlete's foot, and candidiasis, which is a yeast infection of the mucous membranes of the mouth, throat, or vagina. Some fungi can attack food crops to produce compounds that are harmful to humans. So not all fungi that you find in the farm is good for you or your plants. Okay, so this is some of the harmful effects of fungi as pathogens, especially as pathogens on plants. They are also important in producing food. So they have commercial importance in food production, specifically for fermented food. So a useful example of this is yeast. Yeast is a type of fungus. It is just usually unicellular. Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It is the most important of all cultured fungi. It is available as many strands of baker's yeast, which is used in bread making, and brewer's yeast, which is used to make wines and other things. Fungi are not all bad. They also have very good uses. Main example that we like to use is the importance of fungi in pharmaceuticals, especially in the production of penicillin. So some fungi will produce their own antibiotics, which is used to treat bacterial infections. Sebab fungi ni kan dia hidup bersama-sama dengan bakteria lain. So ada daripada mereka, dia akan hasilkan dia punya ubat sendiri supaya dia boleh bunuh bakteria di sekeliling dia, supaya dia saja yang hidup di dalam persekitaran itu, which is why some fungi produce antibiotics. The first antibiotic that was discovered was penicillin, which is made by the Ascomycete mold called Penicillium species. Kalau kamu mau, kamu boleh pergi Google, especially on YouTube. There's a lot of stories about this, about the scientist who discovered penicillium. Kalau tidak silap, cerita dia ada buat eksperimen guna petri dish. Dan satu hari itu dia tertinggal kasih lama sampai berkulat. Tapi sebelum dia buang itu macam baru dia perasan, kenapa ada satu bahagian ni macam tiada bakteria langsung, tapi ada kulat. And then he went on to study that petri dish yang berkulat, and that's how he discovered penicillium. There's many different types of antibiotics that are in the market, and a thing that I would like to remind you is we need to be careful with how we use our antibiotics because some bacteria are actually beginning to become resistant to antibiotics. But that's a topic for another day. So only thing you need to remember from this is the fifth importance of fungi that we learned today is that it is important because of its pharmaceutical use to produce antibiotics. Okay, so that was the last of the importance that I want to tell you about. Here are some interesting video links that I think would be useful for you so you can learn more about kingdom fungi, how they made life on land possible. There's also a short documentary if you like documentary. And if you want something more interesting, there's also this video from National Geographic. You didn't know mushrooms could do all this. And also the secret language of trees if you want to learn more about mycorrhizae. Okay, so just a very, very, very quick summary of what we did in today's lesson and video, which is we looked at the unique characteristics of kingdom fungi. We talked about the three phylum that are in kingdom fungi, which is Phylum Zygomycota, Phylum Ascomycota, and Phylum Basidiomycota. And last but not least, we talked about the importance of fungi. We have 5 main points, but of course, those are not the only points. There are many other importance of fungi as well. Okay, so that's the end for this subtopic. Yay! So what should you do now? Go ahead and come up with your own short notes for this subtopic, and after that, please complete the Google Form quiz for this subtopic and try to answer this tutorial question, Chapter 1, Part B, Question 2. It's very simple, very straightforward. I wish you the best, and I hope to see you again in the next lesson. Happy learning, and goodbye!